appears that we have reached our final presentation of the day. So our next speaker is Michelle Suranofsky from Lehigh University, who I think has been perhaps our most loyal attendee at the VuFind Summit. I think she's been to every one since we started. And she is going to talk to us about integrating VuFind with external APIs, lessons learned.
Okay. So as Jamie mentioned, today I'm going to talk about 3 different integrations that we worked on at Lehigh with external APIs. And I'm going to talk about the problems that we ran into and how we worked around them, and just kind of lessons learned on my end. So when I was preparing this, my slides, I read someplace a tweet or an article that said, your first slide should be your conclusions. So here are my conclusions. When you're integrating or working on any integration, test your edge cases early. And in this context, I mean like a humongous MARC record or a humongous EAD record. Never assume that a production API of your vendor will be as fast as the test API for the vendor. And also plan that calls to your vendor's APIs will fail in worse ways that you could have imagined. So those are the conclusions, and I'll just dig into the 3 different integrations. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Lehigh's integration with archive space. This came about as part of a grant application that our special collections department worked on. Department put together. And this was just to make these specific finding aids that they would be creating as part of the grant more discoverable. So we pitched as part of the grant integrating with archive space where the finding aids would live. We pitched that integration. So basically VuFind, I added an extra tab to it. Finding aid in these particular records. The way it works is the EAD records are transformed into MARC records. So it transforms EDA into MARC so they can be indexed by VuFind. And VuFind looks for a value and if it sees it there, when this details page is displayed, then it adds a tab. And when the tab is clicked on, then the VuFind code calls the archive space API and grabs everything and displays it. It's pretty straightforward. There's not really a lot of code. The archive space API was intuitive, so it really wasn't too bad to create. Make sure I covered all my points. In VuFind, there's a archive space that contains the archive space user ID and password that we set up for this integration, also the endpoint for the archive space application. Where the problem came in was, during development, I thought I was working with large EAD files until I hit like the Mac Daddy of an EAD file. And that really slowed the API call down. So what I ended up having to do as a workaround is not display that very last piece of the hierarchy in the EAD file, like the physical box details. So I ended up leaving that off. You know, now that I've had some time away from it, I think that I could probably go back and make it just more dynamic. Like if someone clicks on a record, I could go in and get those box details. We're also now using the archive space user interface, the public user interface, so I could point VuFind to that for people that wanted to see more detail. But I think it worked out well. Special Collections Department was happy with it. We did what we said we would do in the grant. It's just, it was a lesson learned on my part. So I thought I would share that as part of this kind of my integration stories. And then in 2016, we decided that we would integrate with Relay, who is our interlibrary loan provider, the software that we use for interlibrary loan through Palsy. So this allows our patrons to request an interlibrary loan in VuFind, so they don't have to leave. So the previous workflow was, if an item was unavailable, there's a link, they would click request through Palsy. It takes them to the outside application where they would be prompted to log in. They have to search for the thing and then click the button to request it. And with this integration, basically they still click a link to request it, but the dialogue all happens in VuFind. It does prompt them to sign in, and then it gives them a little dialog box like checking for availability. And if the API does return an available response, then they get this little pop-up that says, it's available to request, would you like to request it? And that's it. It's kind of a nice, simple workflow. Let's see. And the way I coded it originally, before I found the speed issue with the production API, was that when this page was displaying, I was making the API call. So if the item was unavailable and this page was displaying, I would call out to the Relay API to check the availability. And as this page is coming up, I would know it's requestable through the Relay API or not. If it's not, then I would still send them out to the traditional way. If it was available, it would be a link to start this internal workflow, if that makes sense. So in other words, the problem I ran into was, since I was making an API call while this page was being returned or being constructed, when I plugged in the when I plugged in the production API, I kind of had everything done. I'm like, okay, now I'm going to plug in production and I'm going to, really, do a real request. And the test API, I think, was taking like 5 seconds to respond. The production API took 15 seconds or more. I tried to be, when I was creating this presentation, it actually took 20 seconds. So I can't take 20 seconds to bring this details page up. So again, it was really a bad assumption on my part. I always assumed that, a test API endpoint would probably be slower than your production API endpoint, right? It's probably on your, cheapest machine and yada yada, but no. They don't connect to as many, like in the real world for the production API, they connect to like 50 different libraries, and they don't do that with their test API, so they work differently. So that was my lesson learned there. Kind of the interesting thing about it is, or one of the interesting things about it is the workaround. So what I do is, when this page initially comes up, the link still works the old way. It points them to the outside Relay application to make the request. So if you're a fast clicker, you come in here and scroll down and click right away, you're probably going to be sent to our external form, and you're going to request the interlibrary loan the old way. If this page has enough time, like the 15 or 20 seconds, to go out and make the request and get a response back, like yes, it's available, then there's JavaScript on this page that transforms the link into a link that kicks off the internal integrated process. So if the item's not available or the person clicks too fast and I haven't got a response back, then they're going through the old way. If the timing works out and the item's available, which it is in use, so I think it does work out a lot of the time, then they'll use this new integrated process. And the last integration that I want to talk about is using EBSCO's EDS API for article search. this isn't something that I wrote. This is something that's already built into VuFind that we just are using. And before I get into the bad stuff, I just want to say something good. And that's that, I mean, the integration does work very well. Last year, Lehigh purchased the EBS service, and we initially planned to use their native user interface for the article searches. We hadn't planned on using this at all. We kind of knew there was some kind of VuFind integration, but we didn't know a lot about it. So we were moving forward with the plan of using EBSCO's user interface. And then one day in my local development environment, I just plugged in the user ID and password for the API. And basically, and there's one other setting, a profile setting, and it just turned it on. So, you know, I went to my local URL, localhost, and went to /EDS, and it just worked. Like, there was article searching, faceting, and I mean, that happens not a lot. You usually are going to see an error or something that you have to work through. So it does work well, and it did not take a lot to get it working. I mean, we customized the interface a little bit to get it the way we wanted it, but for the most part, it worked well right out of the box. And so when I showed it to my team, like, hey, this is, you know, it works. I didn't do anything. I put in the user ID and password, and what do you think? And the director of my team and my teammate liked the idea of being able to search articles and show articles in an interface that our patrons are already familiar with, because we've had VuFind in place for quite a while. And we had our subject librarians look at it. They liked it. So we decided to move forward with this integration instead of using EBSCO's user interface. So as soon as I had the subject librarians start testing it, they uncovered a couple of bugs, which I realized were fixed in VuFind 4. So at that time, we were on, I think, VuFind 2.5, something like that. So we just decided to do the upgrade along with this integration at the same time. So we upgraded to 4.2. And I knew from the beginning that if there were problems with the EDS API, the catalog search would still have to work. If the article search API wasn't communicating, if there was a problem, the catalog search had to stay up, and it's one of our, you know, our most used applications for the library. Like, it's important; it has to stay up. And I knew that, and I tried to put bad URLs in and the wrong password, user ID and password, and to make sure that the interface stayed up. And you know, I thought I had a pretty good handle on it, and then this happened. We started getting, this was like a Friday night, response from the vendor, invalid IP. So, and it was just on the production server. So the test server was working wonderfully, but just on the production server, they were blocking our IP address. I think there was some kind of security issue going on, so they had blocked, I think, not just our IP address, but some of their other customers. And that made the whole catalog, that made the whole application go down. So I was kind of frantically, that evening, trying to fix it. And then maybe a week or two later, this one happened. Network is unreachable. That made bad things happen too. You know, things that I didn't expect. So I think I have it under control now. But it's challenging in a few different aspects. So the one challenge is that VuFind uses two different endpoints to do authentication, getting a session token, and also the search. So that just means there's 3 different places that it could fail in different ways. the authentication and the session tokens are cached and they eventually expire. So that makes it even more complex. You know, even if the API is down, things could be cached and working fine. It makes it harder to test a failure when this stuff is cached. And the code is somewhat complex, and I didn't write it. So there's a learning curve there to kind of figure out, you know, what's calling what. And last, you can't really predict what's going to go wrong with the API and, you know, what kind of response you're going to get back from it. So in the end, I ended up doing a couple things to get it under control. And one was I ended up using a free service called Maki.io. And I was originally going to write this myself, and then I found this service that's just super easy to use where you go in and you tell it what bad thing you want it to return, and it gives you a URL. So then I could use these, you know, bad URLs in place of EBSCO's URLs, and I could really test some failures over several days on our test server. And that really allowed me to get a handle on it. And the other thing I did was I wrote a program that hits their API every 5 minutes. And if it gets a bad response, I get an email. And that's just one way for me to stay on top of it. But I feel pretty good now after I put the Maki URLs in the configuration file, and I let it sit there for a couple of days. I mean, there is an error message, but it's a nice error message. Like catalog article search is not available right now. And the catalog is still searchable, and the whole application doesn't go down. But it was definitely kind of a nerve-wracking process, and it's still not 100% guaranteed, but it helped me test different failure scenarios so that I can make sure the catalog responds gracefully. That's all I wanted to mention. And then just in general, we're planning for another an integration and a customization. We use a form and just a kind of a homegrown application to request things from storage or something from special collections. So I'm planning on, and that's a web services on the back end of it. So I'm planning on integrating that into VuFind, where it'll just be, you know, they'll be able to stay in here, kind of one-click request instead of going out to another application. And we're also planning on adding paging. So if someone wants us to pull something off the shelf, they can request it, and we're going to prompt them, our patron, to sign in, check to see if they're faculty or student. And if they're faculty and staff, the item will actually get mailed to them. If they're a student, they can pick it up at our holds desk. And all of those, that messaging will be dynamic based on, you know, who they are, which we'll be able to detect after they sign in. So that's all I have. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hi, this is Sarah. I don't have a question. I have a comment.
Okay.
I don't think it came up at least as clearly as I needed to. From our experience, one very important aspect of API integrations is that we need to put blame where it belongs. Otherwise, we get all the feedback by running VuFind, which doesn't work, sort of. So is that your, actually the question is that, is it also your experience that you get all the blame when something goes down and it's not your fault?
Not really. I mean, the people at Lehigh are terrific. Like, before I worked at Lehigh, I worked at an insurance company, and you know, the people at Lehigh are just so grateful when it's fixed. So they're really wonderful, but I put a lot of put a lot of pressure on myself, thinking, you know, I really should have had this ironed out better before it's Friday night, and you know, they're denying our IP address. So I put a lot of it on myself, and yeah, Lehigh is awesome though. The people, they're not too harsh.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up.
services that are at.
Yeah.
I find it really, really handy to say exactly how it's happening. And then to be able to pass it.
Yeah.
Just because just to take a look at what something that's fuzzy that could involve more many systems.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Isolate the problem. Yeah. Yeah.
Just sort of a feedback suggestion in relation to your email pinging the
Oh, yeah.
EBS API.
Yeah.
What we've ended up doing here is we turn on the Slack logger, and we have our own Slack with a VuFind channel, and all the critical errors that get thrown at any point in VuFind just go to that Slack channel, and it's been really valuable in both being aware of sudden problems and also discovering little subtle things that we never even knew were happening.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Connecting your VuFind issues with Slack. I like that. Yeah. Thanks.
It's also good at eating up our Slack message account.
That's true. That's true.
Right? Thank you.
All right. Well, I believe that concludes the streamed portion of the meeting today. Thanks again for attending in one form or another. And if you're not here in person this year, maybe we'll see you next time.